Hey listeners, this is Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and you're listening to episode 45 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is Barabbas, Jesus? One of the more famous scenes from the Passion narratives is the choice offered to the crowd in Jerusalem to have released to them either Barabbas or Jesus. They choose Barabbas, who is connected to insurrection and murder in the Gospels of Mark and Luke, and banditry in the Gospel of John, which, by the way, was itself sometimes connected to rebellion. In all three of those Gospels, when Pontius Pilate presents the choice to the crowd, Barabbas' name is simply Barabbas. But something different shows up in the Gospel of Matthew. Here is Matthew chapter 27, verses 16 through 17, as they appear in the New Revised Standard Version. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So, after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Did you catch that? Matthew has not one, but two Jesuses. Well, some manuscripts of Matthew do, and some don't. In a paper published in New Testament Studies back in 2011 entitled Jesus Barabbas, a Nominal Messiah, Text and History in Matthew chapter 27 verses 16 through 17, Robert Moses of High Point University looks at the manuscript evidence for the reading Jesus Barabbas and pushes back against scholarly opinions about the historicity of the name and the reason some manuscripts omit it. For starters, Moses looks at the external evidence, both for and against the reading Jesus Barabbas. The shorter reading of simply Barabbas, sometimes with the definite article, appears in a variety of manuscript families, while the longer reading of Jesus Barabbas, sometimes with the definite article, has, in his words, relatively slender external support, appearing primarily in a single family, as well as in some ancient translations. For those who may not be familiar with the lingo, in textual criticism, a family refers to how scholars categorize manuscripts that have similar readings associated with specific geographic regions that may not appear in other distinct manuscripts from other regions. And sometimes, instead of referring to them as a family, you'll hear them refer to it as a text type. In general, there are four: Alexandrian, Caesarean, Western, and Byzantine. Despite this, there is a relatively early important witness to the longer reading: Origen of Alexandria. In his commentary on Matthew, written in the 3rd century, Origen reveals that he knew of some manuscripts of Matthew that didn't read Jesus Barabbas, a sign that he not only knew of the reading, but that the manuscript he was working from probably had it. Next, Moses looks at transcriptional probability. If the reading wasn't original, how did it get there? If it was, how was it removed? This section of Moses' work requires some knowledge of textual criticism generally, as well as Koine Greek, so we simply do not have the time to go into it here. I will point out that Moses thinks that based on transcriptional probability, the reading of Jesus Barabbas was original. Following this, Moses gets to his disagreement with trends in scholarship regarding the origin of the name Jesus Barabbas. As he notes, there are three camps: those who argue Barabbas was another aspect of Jesus' identity, those who argue there was a historical figure with the personal name Jesus who also went by the patronymic Barabbas, and finally, those who argue for Matthean redaction of Mark. In the pages that follow, Moses deals with each in turn. The first, that Jesus had two names, is bizarre to say the least. Time does not permit a full consideration here, but Moses notes that some scholars propose that Jesus underwent two trials by Pilate, and that Pilate didn't realize he had tried Jesus twice. The second, that there were in fact two Jesuses, one of which was known as Jesus Barabbas, depends on the fact that Jesus was a relatively common name in first century Judea. Why couldn't there be two Jesuses? But this opens the door for an obvious question. Why do the other gospel writers omit it? Some scholars have argued that the evangelists did know of it, but dropped it out of reverence for Jesus. This proposal makes sense in light of later scribal practices. After all, if the original reading in Matthew's Gospel was Jesus Barabbas, and we have manuscripts without it, it's possible that these scribes deliberately removed it. Perhaps the evangelists did the same thing, with Matthew being the sole exception. But Moses is unconvinced and notes that we don't have any good evidence that the scribal practices of later eras were at work among the evangelists themselves. In fact, we have evidence to the contrary. For example, in Acts chapter 13, verse 6, we find reference to a man named Bar-Jesus, the son of Jesus, who is in verse 10 referred to as the son of the devil. If omitting Jesus before Barabbas made sense because of how bad a person he was, how much more then the devil? Third, and finally, Moses considers why Matthew, in his redaction of Mark's Gospel, inserts the name Jesus. Drawing on the work of Donald Sr., Moses notes that Jesus Barabbas does a lot of theological work for the Matthean evangelist. Earlier I mentioned that Origen, a theologian who wrote in the 3rd century CE, knew of the reading Jesus Barabbas. But there's more. In a section in his commentary dealing with Matthew chapter 24, verse 5, a text wherein Jesus warns that others will come along claiming to be their Messiah, Origen connects this warning to Barabbas, stating that while he had the name Jesus, he was not the Messiah, Jesus. Moses writes, Origen was on the right track in helping us detect why Matthew would insert the name Jesus before Barabbas. For Matthew, Barabbas is a nominal Messiah who deceives the many. In essence, this is an example of Matthean dramatic irony. The crowd must choose which Jesus they will follow. There is Jesus Barabbas, a notorious prisoner, and there is Jesus of Nazareth, referred to with biting irony as the King of the Jews by Pilate, but one who is, in fact, their messianic monarch. But Jesus Barabbas, insofar as the pericope is concerned, is an invention of Matthew. A smart invention, but an invention nonetheless. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time, and remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for listening.